Okay, so this recording is for Module 12, Marine Biology. So we've been working our way through different marine communities. So we did the intertidal zone, we did estuaries, and we did coral reefs. And now today we are going to do the continental shelf communities. And just so we are, we're all on the same page, let's go ahead and take a look at a figure of a continental shelf. So when we talk about the continental shelf, we're talking about this area that is exists from the land to just before we get this shelf break or drop off. So so it goes from the area of low tide until where you get this sharp decline in the continental slope. This area, generally, it averages about 50 miles in width. So in terms of how far out in the ocean that it goes. And in terms of its depth, it averages about 200 feet deep. It can't, but generally it is considered anything less than, generally we would say it's less than 500 feet, but the average depth is about 200 feet. So the depth of the water in the continental shelf. As you might expect, the amount of life that you find on the continental shelf depends on the temperature. So there are more species living in the continental shelf. In warm areas of the world compared to colder areas. And that shouldn't be that unexpected. That shouldn't be an unexpected statement for you. Let's go ahead and review a few terms because these terms do apply to the continental shelf and we will be using them in our discussion. Okay, so the first term I want to review is benthos or benthos. And you'll remember that these are animals that live on the bottom. So in this case, they would live on the bottom of the continental shelf. So this term doesn't just apply to the bottom of the deep sea, but the bottom of any area. If they live on the bottom, they're considered benthos. And then we use the word nekton. And nektonic animals would be those that swim in the water above the continental shelf. And then the term plankton, or planktonic, would be those organisms that drift or can't swim. So they drift in the water above the continental shelf. So again, all we're doing here is applying these terms specifically to the area that we are studying, and that is the continental shelf. So we would say that we would say that the continental shelf is subtidal. And you probably know that the word sub means under. So in other words, the continental shelf is under the tide. So in other words, the continental shelf stays underwater at all times. Regardless of the tides. So it is always covered in water. Because the tide area, we can go back to that picture, the tide area would be this area here, where you get the uncovering during low tide and covered during high tide, but the continental shelf is always underwater. Another thing that is one other thing that is true of the continental shelf is that the salinity and the temperature stay pretty constant. And the reason for that is that you're going to, at the continental shelf, you're going to have constant wave action, and that's going to keep the water mixing really well, and it's going to keep it distributed well, so that the temperature and the salinity will stay constant. It also means that the nutrients are pretty evenly distributed. So the reason for these things being true is because of the wave action and the mixing that you get with that, with the action of the waves. So as you can imagine, on the continental shelf, you're going to get nutrients that are carried into the continental shelf from rivers or from estuaries, but because of the constant wave action, those get mixed up very well and get evenly distributed. Okay, so what we are going to, I want to give you an idea of where we are going in this chapter. So in terms of the habitats within the continental shelf, we are going to talk about soft bottom communities, and for the soft bottom, we will talk about those that are vegetated and those that are non-vegetated. And then, so that's one type of habitat, soft bottom, vegetated and non-vegetated. And then we are going to talk about hard bottom. And under the hard bottom, we will be discussing rocky bottoms, and we will be discussing, and then we will be discussing kelp. Okay, so we'll work our way through these different habitats and the type of life that we find in the different habitats. Okay, so let's start with the soft bottom. And before we do that, we need to define again a few terms, some of which you've already encountered in your reading, but we haven't taken time to really define those. So obviously the bottom, whether it's soft or hard, what we're really talking about is what is the substrate, what is the substance that is on the bottom of a continental shelf, and then we classify that as either soft or hard. So a couple of terms that you need to know. One is infauna, and infauna are those organisms that are buried in the sediment. And then epifauna refers to those organisms that live on the surface. So infauna would be those organisms like crabs and other organisms that actually burrow down into the soft bottom. Epifauna would be those that live on the surface. So here we will be talking about things like rays or flounder. Those are those types of flatfish that often live on the bottom. So in the soft bottom substrate, so we're still talking about soft bottom, so I'll write that up there again. In the soft bottom of the continental shelf, there are a large number of species that live here, and one of the reasons for that is because of the fact that the temperature and salinity are pretty constant. So the organisms don't have to worry about surviving wide variations in salinity and temperature. So there are a lot of different species that live here. And then in addition to that, different species can live at different depths. So that also leads to a wide variety of species living here. In the soft bottom, the organisms or the bottom itself can either be sandy or it can be muddy. We've seen this before when we were talking about estuaries. And so the difference really in a sandy is made up of larger particles, and mud is made up of smaller particles. And muddy often also involves like where organic material or like waste builds up. So different organisms will live in a certain area, depending on whether it is sandy or muddy. And that the organisms in the soft bottom also, they tend to live in clumps, and we're not sure. So on the soft bottom, the organisms tend to clump. Marine biologists think that may be due to the fact that the substrate might be unevenly distributed. So in other words, it might clump the different substrates might be more, because they're not evenly distributed, then the organisms will clump together on their preferred substrate. So in other words, if you have an organism that likes a particular type of substrate, and if that substrate is in one area but not in another, it makes sense that many of the organisms would congregate in the area where that substrate exists. Okay. Okay. So then the other way that we divide the soft bottom is vegetated and non-vegetated, and those terms should make sense to you. Let's go back and let me show you a picture of. So I think I had let's do this one. So here's a soft bottom habitat, and as we said, one of the organisms that will live on the bottom is a stingray. So you can see that there. These are organisms that might live in a sandy substrate, so they're able to burrow down into the sand, and sand is larger particles than mud. Here's a couple predators that live on the soft bottom. So lobsters and flounders would live on the bottom, and they would be, predators for other organisms that are living there. Okay, so vegetated and unvegetated or non-vegetated. So obviously the vegetated is an area where a lot of plants grow, and the non-vegetated is where the plant life is very sparse. So let me say a few things about let's see. Let's go ahead and talk. Let's go ahead and start with the non-vegetated first. Talk about some of the organisms that might live in a non-vegetated soft bottom. So non-vegetated soft bottom. So one of the things that remember that in order for plants to survive in the ocean, they need to anchor on a hard substrate. And so obviously in a soft bottom, they are going to have trouble finding that hard substrate. So that means that there are very few plants in this area. So then, if there are very few plants, then what are the producers in this area? If plants are not the producers, what are? And the answer to that is the diatoms. So we've learned about those before. So the diatoms would be the primary producers. So they are the organisms that are doing photosynthesis. Since there are not a lot of producers, there are a few plants to be producing oxygen and utilizing CO2. However, even the diatoms are not present in large numbers, and so the other source of food for organisms living here besides the diatoms is something called detritus. And what detritus is, so this is an important food source for the soft bottom where there aren't a lot of plants. Can't get a T there. And what detritus is that it's basically organic waste. So that builds up. So by organic waste, we mean that it's a lot of dead organisms and also the waste that is eliminated from organisms, and it gets carried into the continental shelf from streams and from estuaries. And then the important thing is it is a really important food source. So some of the things that feed on the detritus would be like burrowing worms. Ghost shrimp. Another organism would be like sand dollars. So because there are not a lot of plants, this organic waste, which is called detritus, serves as an important food source for them. In terms of how these organisms eat the detritus, there are a couple of different ways for them to obtain their food. And one of those ways is some of these organisms have tentacles, and they will use the tentacles to gather the detritus. So they can gather that detritus and use their tentacles to actually move it into their mouth. In addition to that, some of them will actually just eat the sediment. So they'll eat whatever it is that is on the bottom, they will eat it, and then their digestive systems kind of sort it out. They sort out the detritus from the sediment. The sediment gets eliminated, and the detritus then is used for nutrition. Okay, so so tentacles can be used to gather the detritus into the mouth, or they'll just eat the sediment, and then the detritus gets separated from the sediment, and the sediment gets eliminated from the body. And other things to think about in this in the non-vegetated area, again, still talking about how these organisms get food. We also talk about suspension feeders or deposit feeders. So a suspension feeder would be an organism that filters food out of the water. So they have some type of system that as they are eating, they will take in the water, but then they have some structures in their bodies that help them to filter the food out. So in many ways, similar to how a whale filters plankton out of the water. And then the deposit feeders, they actually have mechanisms in which they are able to vacuum the detritus from the bottom. And again, sometimes that might involve vacuuming the whole substrate and then sorting out the useful detritus. Generally, suspension feeders tend to be more present on a sandy bottom, and the deposit feeders tend to be more on a muddy bottom, and that's simply because there's more detritus that's present on a muddy bottom than on a sandy bottom. So some of the organisms that you might find living here in terms of the epifauna, so those that are living above the water of this area, you might find starfish and other like small crustaceans, because they can live, they'll feed on the dead organisms that settle on the substrate. So if we were just to kind of summarize the key points of the non-vegetated soft bottom, so summary, what would we say in summary about these? Well, we said that there are very few primary producers. So few producers, so that means you don't get a lot of plants. There are diatoms, but not a lot of them. So the food comes primarily from detritus. We haven't mentioned this, but some of the predators in this area would be things like snails, sea stars, starfish. You'll get some crabs and lobsters in this area as well. Okay, so that's a the summary of what we would say about the non-vegetated soft bottom. Okay, now let's look at the vegetated soft bottom. So in the vegetated soft bottom, you're going to get a lot of seagrasses. So remember, so it's not seaweed, it's seagrass, which is a true plant. And these plants will grow vertically, but they also send out horizontal stems. So you'll get growth both vertically and horizontally. Because these are true grasses, they do have roots that are used to anchor the plants. And also those roots are also, besides anchoring the plants, the roots also protect against erosion. So you think about getting all the all the wave action that you're going to have in this area, and so the roots of those plants and anchoring those plants really help to prevent against erosion. So because you have so many plants here, so there's plenty of plant growth. And therefore, that means there are plenty of, there's a very high rate of producers. So those plants that are making oxygen, there's a lot of those in this area. And in addition to the plant growth, you also do get you actually get some algae growing on the plant leaves. And because algae is also a producer, this is a lot of, you're producing a lot of plants in this area. So what happens to all these plant growth? Well, this is the area where you would find a lot of grazers. So those grazers are those animals that go around and eat plants. And so in these areas you would find manatees, you would find sea urchins that will eat the plants, sea turtles. There are some birds also that will eat the plants, some birds. So in the vegetated area of the soft bottom continental shelf is where you will find these organisms living. Now, besides the food, so food is one big function that the vegetated area of the soft bottom provides, but the vegetated area also provides shelter. For many organisms. So you will, some animals will actually attach to the blades, which I'll look at a picture here in a minute, or you'll just see animals kind of hidden among the grasses. So you'll see fish and shrimp and organisms like that that will use the vegetated area for shelter. So look at a couple pictures. So here is a sea lion that's living in a grassy bed. So we'll get some mammals living there. This is a nudibranch, which is an kind of an interesting organism that we don't have time to study, but you've all probably heard of manatees. And so the manatees they are one of the really important organisms that will graze. This figure points out that this nudibranch is, these are not to scale. So the nudibranch on the left is only like 1 to 2 inches long, whereas the manatee can be 10 to 12 feet long. But they're both grazers, and they both live in the seagrass, seagrass that's produced in the vegetated area of the soft bottom. Okay, so that is all we're going to say about the soft bottom. So it's vegetated or it is non-vegetated. And now we're going to look at the hard bottom. Don't lose sight of the fact that we're talking about the soft bottom and the hard bottom of the continental shelf. So, and then in the hard bottom, we are going to talk about a rocky bottom, and we are going to talk about kelp beds and kelp forests. Okay, so that's where we're going with regard to the hard bottom of the continental shelf. So let's start with the rocky bottom. So seaweed is able to anchor on the hard substrate that is on the rocky bottom. And so on the rocky bottom, you get a lot of seaweed growing on the rocky bottom. And in addition to that, so that's one thing that you'll get on the rocky bottom. The other thing that you will get, and seaweed can be classified as this also, you will get sessile organisms. So those organisms that will, anchor themselves onto something, you will get those growing on the rocky bottom. In terms of seaweed, there are lots of different types of seaweed growing on the rocky bottom. So typically seaweed is kind of classified based on color. So there's brown and there's green and there's red, etc. But you'll get different types of seaweed growing in different areas because different types need differing amounts of light different temperatures, and I know we said that the temperature is fairly constant, but you can get some variation in temperatures. They will use different types of substrate. So some seaweeds prefer a softer substrate, others a harder substrate. And the other thing about seaweed is there are some types that grow year round, and other types have a very short growing season. So if for a type that has a short growing season, when that type has run its growth cycle for the year, then it dies, and then another type can move in there and grow in that area. Some types of seaweed grow slowly, some grow fast. So again, those that have a short life, they can when they die, then others are able to move in. Um, so a variety of, I spelled this wrong, that's supposed to be seaweed, a variety of seaweed different types of seaweed that will grow on the rocky bottom depending on the conditions that exist there. So as you can imagine, because it is a rocky bottom, there is very little infauna because they just can't, they can't burrow in very well into a rocky or hard substrate. So there's not much infauna. So that means there is a lot of epifauna. So things living above the rocky bottom, in the water above the rocky bottom, but not much living in the area itself. So some of the things that we would see in these areas would be things like sponges. Anemones are pretty common. And many of these tend to live in colonies. I'll show you a picture of an anemone colony. So they tend to live, congregate together in colonies. However, there are some individual species that don't live in colonies. So in this area, there are also some bivalves. So you'll get things like clams and oysters living here. And there'll be some gastropods like snails. Again, sea urchins. Sea urchins tend to live in a variety of places, but most of the organisms that live here are going to be suspension feeders. So we're still talking about the rocky bottom. So there are many suspension feeders. So those are those that are able to filter out the food from the water. There are some grazers that will also live in the rocky bottom because they basically they can crawl along the bottom and eat the seaweed as they are crawling along the bottom. So you will get some grazers in this area. Let's look at a picture here. So here is a colony of sea anemones growing, typically growing on a hard substrate, and they tend to live in colonies. And then this picture just shows, again, it's a picture of a rocky it's a rocky surface, but you can see that there is a wide variety of organisms living there. So this is all, these are types of seaweed, and then you can see the sea star living there, and some other organisms. Oh, the other thing I was going to show you, remember I said that the seagrasses they provide shelter for organisms. So this should have been back when we were still talking about the soft bottom. But what I wanted to show you was that so you can see on this seagrass that there are a variety of organisms that are actually take shelter on the plant itself. So there's a shrimp and a hydroid, and there's a mollusk. It's a snail, some type of snail. So the seagrass does provide shelter, and then we said that the root system actually can help prevent some erosion from wave activity. So the organisms that eat the seaweed are primarily, so you're going to get some grazers that will eat the seaweed, and then grazers will eat the seaweed, and then you'll get carnivores that will come along and eat the grazers. So then the carnivores eat the grazers. So in terms of the carnivores that you might get, there'll be things like sea stars, snails, crabs, lobsters. So you can see how the food web works even on this rocky bottom. So fish, they then eat the grazers. So what you will find on a rocky bottom, really depends on how much light is there, how much grazing is being done, and how many predators are in that area. Okay, so then the last, the second type of hard bottom is called kelp beds or kelp forests. And these tend to grow in, we tend to find these in colder water, so areas of the world where the water is cold. And they can stretch from the bottom all the way up to the surface. And whether they reach the surface or not is how we define whether it is a bed or a forest. So a kelp bed is not tall enough to reach the surface. So it grows from the bottom, but not tall enough to reach the surface. And a kelp forest then is one in which it grows tall enough to reach the surface. So I'm going to show you a picture of a kelp forest. It's this one. So here is a scuba diver diving among these kelp forests. So this is a forest, so the plants do grow tall enough to reach the surface. Now remember we talked about kelp a little bit earlier in the semester, but kelp does not have roots. What they have are holdfasts. So it's a this is what they use to attach to the substrate. However, they do not. It's not how nutrients. It's not how nutrients get transported. So in a plant that has roots, the roots come up through the soil, the nutrients come up through the soil, and then are delivered through the roots and the root system of the plant to provide nutrition for the plant. But a holdfast is not how kelp gets its nutrients. And maybe you remember that the way that they get nutrients is they absorb the nutrients directly from the water. So they do not get their nutrients from the from roots, because they don't have roots. They have a holdfast that is just used to hold it in place, and they absorb their nutrients directly from the water. So in other words, they need to have water flowing over them. When we talked about kelp previously, we talked about the nematocysts. And you will remember that those nematocysts fill with air. So they are on the edges of the leaves, and these are what help to keep the blades on the surface. And we said that that was important for them to be able to absorb light so that they can do photosynthesis. Okay, so nematocysts. We learned about those previously, but since they have application here, we'll talk about them again. Let me see. Let's see if I have any other pictures. Oh, this is just another type of kelp growing. Can't really see the nematocysts on there. We tend to get, let's see, this figure shows where the kelp forests grow. So if you look at this map of the globe, the purple areas are where we get kelp forests growing. So in general, we said that they grow in cold water, and so in all of these areas up here, we're close to areas where there is cold water that gets circulated around. But then you also notice that there are some kelp forests in more tropical areas. So these are all below the equator. So these would be more tropical areas. But in those areas, because of the way the winds and the rotation of the earth is, cold water can be brought up into these areas. So that is why there still has to be cold water. So around these areas, you can get movement of cold water into those areas, and so then kelp is able to grow. Um, in certain areas, the kelp will actually form a canopy. So especially a kelp forest can form a canopy. And so as you can imagine, that canopy will block the light. And so that obviously is going to impact what can live there. Because if the light can't penetrate into the deeper areas, then then organisms won't be able to live there. So what happens is that you tend to get different habitats in different layers of a kelp forest, because you'll get some organisms, some animals living in areas where light can still penetrate, but as you go deeper and the light is not able to penetrate, then other animals will live there that don't rely so much on light. So, in order for kelp to grow, you need a hard substrate for it to attach. And we said they do that with holdfast. It should grow at a depth where they can get enough light. And we said that they do use the nematocyst to try to keep their the leaves near the surface of the water to get. And then kind of related to this, it grows best in clear water. And that's just because the sunlight can better penetrate the area where where the water is clear compared to cloudy. So there is still a lot of life that is present within a kelp forest, even if there's the canopy that forms and you get some blockage of light, because there are some types of kelp that don't need as much light. There are animals that live among, animals live among the holdfasts. So you'll get different types of animals that will seek shelter and live among the holdfasts. Fish will live along the bottom of a kelp forest, and so they'll live along the bottom or they will live among the blades. There aren't a lot of organisms that eat the kelp, so not many eat kelp. However, when the kelp dies, then what happens? It decays and it decomposes. So even though they don't eat the live kelp, when the kelp dies and decomposes, then it does become a food source for organisms that live on the bottom. So food for so it decomposes and sinks to the bottom, and it becomes food for animals living there. Okay, so even though not many animals eat it, while it is living. One of the organisms that tends to really grow around a kelp forest or kelp beds are sea urchins. So these can really increase, and what they tend to do is they tend to consume the holdfasts, and then of course then the whole plant dies. So it's really important for the ecosystem to keep the population of sea urchins under control in order for the kelp growth to continue. And so when in areas where there is an overpopulation of sea urchins, you can have whole areas where the ground is just barren. The sea ground is just barren because the sea urchins have consumed the holdfast and the kelp plants die. What conditions lead to an overpopulation of sea urchins? There are several. One is that there has been a decline in the sea otter population. And sea otters are predators for the sea urchins. So sea otters are predators for the sea urchins. And so if the population of sea otters is decreasing, then you're going to get an overpopulation of sea urchins, and then that affects the kelp forests. So that's one factor. And, there are a number of things that can lead to the decrease in the sea otter population. Pollution. Some people think that with the warming oceans, we may get a decrease in sea urchin population. And then in addition to that, people tend to fish organisms that feed on the sea urchins. So if we're removing the organisms that typically would use the sea urchins as food, then that's another means by which the sea urchin population. So what feeds on sea urchins? Well, crabs, lobsters, different types of fish. So as people remove these, as we remove these, that then there's less feeding on the sea urchins, and the population of the sea urchins will increase. So again, we see here the importance of keeping the ecosystem in balance and not over harvesting or making sure that we can control the population of one organism so that another organism the population either doesn't get decimated or an area becomes overpopulated with it. Okay, so that is it for Module 12, dealing with the intercontinental or the continental shelf communities.